Margaret never thought betrayal would come from the people she loved most. Her husband, Edward, had passed suddenly, leaving her alone in a house filled with decades of memories, love, and silence. She had spent her life as the quiet backbone of her family, raising her son, Derek, managing the home, and sacrificing her own dreams. But when Edward was gone, the loyalty she trusted dissolved. It began subtly. Derek and his pregnant wife, Vanessa, visited less. Calls went unanswered. Pleasantries turned cold. Margaret brushed it off, thinking grief had made them distant. But then the unthinkable happened. One morning, they showed up at her door, smug and commanding. "Mom, it's time you moved out. The house is too big for one person. We need space for the baby," Derek said. His words carried the arrogance of a child who forgot the meaning of respect. Vanessa added, "You'll be happier elsewhere," her tone sharp and dismissive. Margaret's heart shattered, but she refused to cry. She pleaded, reminded them of her sacrifices, of the love she had poured into their lives. They laughed coldly, handed her a 1-week deadline, and walked away. Within hours, Margaret's life became a nightmare. She packed decades of memories into 6 small boxes and moved to a tiny motel room. Walls cracked, bed creaking, bathroom shared with strangers. Humiliation swallowed her, but she survived. She ate stale bread, slept in silence, and watched the family she nurtured celebrate her absence. Then, amidst the darkness, a spark ignited. Hidden under a wedding photograph, Margaret discovered letters from Edward. Letters revealing investments, properties, and wealth she had never known existed. At that moment, she realized the terrifying and beautiful truth. She was no longer powerless. The woman they tried to erase was about to return, not broken, not begging, but transformed. And when Derek and Vanessa came back, expecting apologies or tears, they would meet a force they could never anticipate. Margaret's first night in the motel felt endless. She lay on the thin, lumpy mattress, staring at the cracked, peeling ceiling above her. Every sound from the street outside, sirens wailing, cars honking, people shouting, felt like it was meant for her. She hugged the thin blanket around her, trying to make herself feel safe. But the sense of loss was suffocating. For decades, her home had been filled with love, laughter, and memories, and now it had been taken from her by the people she trusted the most, her own son, Derek, and his wife, Vanessa. She remembered the day they told her she had to leave, their cold faces, the way they laughed as if all the years of her sacrifices meant nothing. She remembered the piles of boxes she had packed, each one containing fragments of her life. Photographs of birthdays, letters from Edward, old ornaments and keepsakes that held decades of memories. Each item packed felt like a little piece of her heart being carried away. Sleep did not come easily. She rolled over, trying to shut out the noise, trying to imagine herself somewhere else, anywhere else, where she was respected, valued, and loved. She thought about her husband, Edward, how suddenly he had been gone, how she had been left alone to face a world that seemed cruel and unfair. The grief pressed down on her chest like a heavy weight, but deep inside, a spark flickered, a quiet, stubborn determination that refused to die. The next morning, Margaret rose before sunrise. The motel smelled stale and musty, and the small bathroom was shared with strangers who left their towels and shampoos scattered on the counters. She dressed carefully, trying to gather herself, and walked into the harsh light of the morning. Her first goal was simple: find work. But the world seemed to have moved on without her. At 64, doors closed before they even opened. Managers shook their heads. "You're too old," they said. "We're sorry, we don't have anything for you." But Margaret refused to give in. She remembered Edward, her late husband, who had always planned quietly, without fanfare. He had prepared for emergencies, for life's uncertainties, and somehow she felt that same quiet strength within herself now. She would not let this be the end of her story. She would survive. She would rise again. Every step she took on that cracked motel floor was a promise to herself. No matter how unfair life had been, she would not remain powerless. She would find a way to take control, to rebuild, to reclaim the dignity and respect that had been stolen from her. That night, staring at the ceiling, she had felt small and broken. But that morning, in the cold light of reality, Margaret felt something else, the first glimmer of hope, a faint flame of courage that whispered, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." Margaret spent the first week in the motel quietly, feeling the sting of humiliation every day. She watched from her small window as her house, her sanctuary, her decades of memories, was now filled with Derek and Vanessa. They moved freely through the rooms she had once tended, laughed where she had once laughed, and planned their new life in the space she had built with love. At first, the anger was sharp, like a knife in her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run back and confront them, but deep down she knew that rage alone would not give her back what was hers. While unpacking her few belongings, she came across a small, forgotten box of Edward's things. Inside, beneath a faded wedding photograph, were letters, carefully hidden letters that Edward had written to her over the years. Margaret had never noticed them before. They weren't just ordinary love letters. They contained something far more powerful. Edward had quietly invested in properties, stocks, and businesses. He had set up accounts, insurance policies, and even a trust fund, things he had never mentioned, assuming Margaret would eventually inherit them when the time came. Margaret's hands shook as she read through each letter, realizing that Edward had left her a treasure trove of wealth, security, and influence. A strange feeling washed over her. It was as if a heavy fog that had clouded her mind for decades had lifted. She had always thought she was powerless, dependent, and vulnerable. But now she understood the truth. She had been powerful all along. Edward had prepared her without her realizing it, and now it was her turn to take control. Margaret sat back on the worn motel bed, feeling a mix of grief and exhilaration. The life she had lost, her home, her comfort, the love she had poured into her family, could be rebuilt. Not in the way it had been, but in a way that would make her untouchable. She could reclaim her dignity, her respect, and even her home. But this time she would not beg. She would not plead. She would plan, she would act, and she would win. That night she made a silent vow to herself. Derek and Vanessa thought they had pushed her aside, that she was broken, and that she would fade into obscurity. They were wrong. Margaret was about to rise, not as the obedient, quiet woman they knew, but as a force they could never anticipate. The fire of revenge, of reclamation, and of justice had been lit, and nothing would stop it. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in decades. The motel room still smelled of mildew, the walls were cracked, and the bed creaked under her weight. But none of that mattered. She had discovered something far greater than comfort or convenience. She had discovered power, waiting quietly for her to claim it. She spent hours going through Edward's letters, bank statements, and property documents. Each page revealed possibilities she had never imagined. Real estate investments in thriving neighborhoods, a small but profitable business in town, stocks that had grown steadily over the years. Edward had left her a foundation to not only survive, but to dominate. Margaret realized that she had been underestimated for far too long, and now it was her time to turn the tables. Her plan began to take shape. First, she needed allies. She contacted a trusted lawyer, one Edward had worked with for years, and carefully outlined her intentions. She would not act in haste. This was a chess game, not a street fight. Every move would be calculated, every step deliberate. Margaret would make Derek and Vanessa understand that the woman they had mocked and discarded was untouchable. Next, she began to rebuild her public image. She dressed smartly, polished her presence, and carried herself with a confidence that even she was surprised to feel. No longer would she shrink in the shadows. She walked into cafes, banks, and town offices with her head held high, quietly gathering information about her properties, tenants, and financial opportunities. Each visit strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just reclaiming her life, she was transforming it. But Margaret's plan was not only about wealth, it was about respect. She remembered the humiliation of being kicked out of her own home, the laughter, the coldness, the betrayal. Derek and Vanessa had assumed she would crumble, that she would fade into obscurity. They were wrong. Every call she made, every meeting she attended, every signature she put on a document was a step toward reclaiming what was hers. And when the day came for her to confront them, she would do it not with tears, but with undeniable power. As the sun set over the motel, Margaret stood by the window and looked toward her house, the house that had once been her sanctuary, now occupied by those who had betrayed her. She didn't feel anger anymore. She felt determination. She didn't feel fear. She felt strategy. She didn't feel weakness. She felt a storm brewing, quiet but unstoppable. Margaret knew one thing for certain. The woman they thought was broken, the woman they thought was powerless, was about to return, and nothing would ever be the same. The day finally came. Margaret walked up the familiar steps of her own home, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, a sound that felt like thunder in the ears of the unprepared. Derek and Vanessa were inside, expecting nothing more than a frail, pleading figure at their mercy. They did not recognize the woman who stood at the door now. Margaret opened the door without knocking. "I'm home," she said, her voice calm but sharp, carrying the weight of every betrayal, every insult, every sleepless night she had endured. Derek froze. Vanessa's face turned pale. They had imagined her begging, crying, maybe even turning away. But not this. Not the confident, commanding presence that now filled the house. "Mom, we thought you—" Derek stammered. "Save it," Margaret interrupted, her eyes locking onto him with steel. "This house, this life, everything Edward built, it's mine. Not yours to control, not yours to steal. And I'm not asking, I'm telling." Vanessa tried to interject, her voice rising in panic, but Margaret's hand lifted, cutting off the air like a sword. "No. You've had your time, your fun. You laughed at me. You pushed me out and you assumed I would vanish. That was your first mistake. And your second? Underestimating me." She began walking through the house, her presence reclaiming every corner. She opened drawers, picked up letters and documents, and casually mentioned investments, properties, and assets Edward had left behind. Derek's jaw tightened. Vanessa's confidence melted. "You thought this would be easy," Margaret said, standing in the living room that once echoed with laughter and warmth. "But life doesn't reward cruelty. It rewards preparation, intelligence, and resilience. And I have all three." By the time the confrontation ended, Derek and Vanessa were speechless, stripped of arrogance, stripped of control. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm authority, combined with undeniable evidence of power, made her unassailable. That night, as Derek and Vanessa retreated into shame, Margaret sat in her restored home, looking around at the life she had reclaimed. The pain of betrayal lingered, yes, but it had transformed into something stronger: wisdom, dignity, and invincible self-respect. Margaret realized that this was more than revenge. It was a declaration. The woman they thought was powerless would never be underestimated again. The woman who had been pushed aside had become unstoppable. From that day on, anyone who doubted her, anyone who tried to control her, knew the truth. Margaret was no longer a victim. She was a force, calm, relentless, and victorious. Margaret didn't just return. She returned with a plan. She purchased a luxury penthouse in the heart of the city, a place that seemed to rise above the world itself. The marble floors reflected her determined steps. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline that whispered success, and every corner of the space carried an air of quiet power. Designer furniture, soft classical music, subtle scents. Everything spoke a single truth. She had transformed, and she was untouchable. Her transformation wasn't just about wealth. It was about presence. Margaret spent weeks refining herself. She studied style, poise, and the art of command. Her hair, her clothes, even the way she walked was intentional. Every gesture radiated confidence. Every glance hinted at experience and control. She was no longer the timid, pleading figure who had been forced out of her home. She was calculated, sharp, and luminous. Margaret didn't just change herself, she changed her environment. The penthouse was more than luxury. It was a statement. Every guest who entered would know immediately. This woman had rebuilt her life from betrayal, grief, and humiliation. She had not only survived, she had thrived. She invited a few trusted advisors, business contacts, and even old friends for dinner, showing the world that she was connected, capable, and respected. Word of her return spread quietly but surely, reaching Derek and Vanessa in whispers, rumors, and secondhand stories. They began to realize that the woman they had dismissed as weak had become something far more formidable. Margaret took her time, observing, planning her interactions with her family. There would be no rash confrontations, no petty revenge. Every move she made now was strategic, measured. She knew that real power wasn't shown through anger or shouting. It was shown through control, influence, and confidence. And as she stood on her balcony one evening, looking out at the city lights flickering below, Margaret felt the thrill of inevitability. The days of being powerless were over. She had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had amplified it. And soon, Derek and Vanessa would see exactly what it meant to underestimate her. Margaret smiled, calm and unshakable. The woman they tried to erase was back, and this time she was writing the rules. Margaret's return was not just about style or presence. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Quietly, carefully, she purchased the mortgage on her old home. Derek and Vanessa had no idea. Every late payment, every financial struggle, every decision about the house now passed through her hands. For the first time, the power dynamic had completely shifted. She watched from a distance as they struggled with the bills, frustrated calls, and the pressure she subtly applied. Derek, who once spoke to her with arrogance, now hesitated before every word. Vanessa, who had dismissed her as old and powerless, now found herself quietly asking for advice on things she used to ignore. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to command respect, fear, and attention. Every room in that house carried decades of memories, but Margaret didn't rush back in. Instead, she allowed herself to savor the moment. She remembered the birthdays she had organized, the sacrifices she had made, the nights she had stayed awake worrying about her family. And now, those walls would witness a new chapter, one where she held the power. Margaret even reconnected with neighbors who had once known her as a kind, gentle presence. Their surprise and admiration at her return only fueled her quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about dignity, strategy, and reclaiming her voice. She walked through the rooms, imagining Derek and Vanessa trying to assert control, only to find themselves carefully navigating her terms. Every instruction she gave, every boundary she set, reminded them that the woman they had discarded was no longer weak. She was decisive, confident, and untouchable. Margaret smiled quietly, almost to herself. The woman they had tried to erase, the one they thought they could ignore, now dictated the rules. Power had a new name, and it was hers. The house, once a place of love and loss, was now her kingdom. Every step she took echoed authority. Every glance carried control, and every decision reminded her family. Respect was not optional. It was mandatory. For Margaret, this wasn't revenge. It was justice. The quiet, patient, unstoppable rise of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Derek and Vanessa's calls had been nervous, hesitant, filled with unspoken guilt. They wanted to meet, but Margaret had set the terms. No surprises, no favors. 2 p.m., her penthouse, full transparency. She would not be rushed, cajoled, or manipulated. This was her stage, and the rules had changed. When they arrived, the first thing they noticed was the penthouse itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city. Marble floors gleamed under soft light, and elegant furniture filled the space without clutter. Classical music played in the background, calm yet commanding, like the aura surrounding Margaret herself. Their confidence faltered instantly. This was not the meek mother they had cast aside. It was someone transformed, untouchable, and precise. Margaret stood by the large window, arms crossed, her posture perfect, her gaze steady. "Welcome," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. "You've come to apologize. Let's discuss the truth." Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. Vanessa tried to smile, but it lacked warmth. "Mom, we thought," Derek stammered, unsure how to start. Margaret raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Thought what? That you could erase me? That my sacrifices didn't matter? That I would beg for my own home? Look around. Everything you see, I earned. Everything you lost control over, I reclaimed." Vanessa's face turned pale. We didn't mean to." Margaret shook her head slowly, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Intentions don't erase consequences. You treated me like an outsider in my own life. You laughed while I packed my memories into boxes. You celebrated my absence. And now you come here, hoping I'll forgive you?" Silence filled the room. The weight of her words pressed down on them, suffocating and undeniable. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor, each sound deliberate, echoing authority. "You see, you finally met the woman I've become. Strong, strategic, unstoppable. And you," she paused, letting the moment sink in, "you will learn what respect truly means." Derek and Vanessa had no words left. Their arrogance, their entitlement, melted under the calm, deliberate power of the woman they had tried to destroy. Margaret didn't shout, didn't threaten. Her presence alone was enough to rewrite the rules of their relationship. This was the moment. The reckoning, the confrontation, the undeniable truth. Margaret had returned, not to beg, not to cry, but to show them that a woman pushed to her edge could rise higher than anyone imagined. And in that penthouse, overlooking the city, Margaret finally smiled. She was no longer the quiet, obedient mother. She was the force that could not be ignored. Margaret sat behind her polished desk, the afternoon sunlight spilling across the room, highlighting every detail of her success. Derek and Vanessa stood stiffly before her, unsure, unsettled. The arrogance they once carried like armor had vanished, replaced by something raw, fear, shame, and the bitter taste of their own misjudgment. Margaret didn't rush. She let them feel the weight of the penthouse, the quiet power in every corner, the evidence of a life rebuilt without their consent. Then, in a calm, measured voice, she began. "You took my home, my dignity, my peace," she said slowly, letting each word land. "You laughed while I packed my memories into boxes. You dismissed my sacrifices. You treated me like I was invisible. Every action you took against me was noted. Every betrayal, remembered." Derek opened his mouth, but Margaret held up her hand. "No excuses, no apologies without acknowledgement. Today, you will understand what it feels like to lose control. The same way I did when you left me alone in that motel room, stripped of everything familiar and comfortable." Vanessa's hands trembled, her voice barely audible. "Mom, we didn't think—" Margaret's gaze cut through her like a blade. "You didn't think, and that is exactly why you failed. You underestimated the strength of the person you tried to erase. You assumed grief made me weak. You assumed your power was permanent. But I survived. I adapted. I reclaimed what was mine. And now, the balance has shifted." For the first time, Derek and Vanessa felt the full weight of reality. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and betrayed was no longer dependent on them. She was untouchable. She commanded respect not through anger, not through manipulation, but through quiet, unshakable authority. Every detail of her transformation, her wealth, her presence, her confidence, spoke louder than any words. Margaret leaned back slightly, a calm smile on her lips. "You see," she continued, "betrayal has consequences. Every selfish choice, every dismissive comment, every act of cruelty, they all matter. But so does forgiveness when it's offered on my terms. And today, you are learning both lessons." Derek's shoulders slumped. Vanessa's eyes brimmed with tears. They had been humbled, confronted by the very force they thought they could control. Margaret's words weren't just punishment. They were a mirror, reflecting everything they had done and showing the consequences with perfect clarity. Margaret rose, the soft click of her heels echoing across the penthouse. "Remember this moment," she said softly but firmly. "You will never underestimate me again, and you will never forget that respect is earned, not demanded." For the first time, Derek and Vanessa truly understood. The woman they had tried to destroy was now the woman who held all the power. The one they betrayed had become the one who would define their future, on her terms, and with her full control. And as Margaret watched them leave, humbled and shaken, she finally allowed herself to feel a deep, quiet satisfaction. Justice, she realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming everything they thought they could take, and showing them exactly who she had become. After exposing their betrayal, Margaret felt the quiet power settling around her like a cloak. Derek and Vanessa were no longer the children she had nurtured. They were accountable adults facing the full weight of their actions. She knew this was the moment to define the rules. No more compromises. No more silent suffering. Margaret spoke with calm authority, her voice steady, unwavering. "You have two choices," she said, her eyes locking onto theirs. "You can accept responsibility and rebuild what you broke, or you can walk away and face the consequences of your own mistakes. The choice is yours, but understand this: I will not tolerate dishonesty, disrespect, or evasion ever again." Derek shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by shame. Vanessa clutched her purse, nodding, her eyes brimming with tears. The reality of their actions hit harder than any words could. Margaret continued, outlining her terms with precision. Public apologies to the family and neighbors, financial accountability for debts and obligations, and unwavering respect toward her, always. She saw them absorb each word, felt the tension in the room crack under the weight of truth. No protests, no excuses. Only the recognition that the woman they had discarded was now the ultimate authority, and she would not be trifled with again. Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Every decision, every step she had taken, from the lonely motel nights to discovering Edward's hidden wealth to reclaiming her home, had led to this moment. She had turned pain into power, betrayal into strategy, grief into determination. And now she was untouchable. Derek spoke first, his voice quiet, almost broken. "Mom, we'll do it. We'll take responsibility. We're sorry." Vanessa nodded rapidly, adding, "We understand, and we'll make it right." Margaret studied them carefully, seeing the sincerity, or at least the recognition of reality, behind their eyes. "Good," she said finally. "This is not about revenge. It's about accountability, and it's about respect. Follow these terms, and we can move forward. Fail, and you will understand the consequences of ignoring the person you once tried to erase." With that, a new chapter began. Derek and Vanessa had accepted the rules, and Margaret had secured not only her dignity, but her family's future. She had created boundaries that no one could cross, protecting herself while teaching lessons that would last a lifetime. The woman they thought was fragile and powerless had returned stronger, wiser, unstoppable. She no longer waited for justice, she commanded it. And in that commanding presence, in the quiet strength of her choices, Margaret knew she had finally reclaimed everything that truly mattered: respect, control, and peace. No one would ever underestimate her again.